Well, happy Father's Day. And I say that to everyone out there. It's a very interesting day. And maybe if you actually looked and examined it, and I know I've said these stats in the past, but on Father's Day, we actually spend less money than we do on Mother's Day. We do. And this is illustrated by a story that was recently published where the little boy goes up to the pastor of the church and says, Happy Father's Day. And the pastor turns to the little boy and says, well, do you know what Father's Day is? To which the little boy responded by saying, why, yes, it's like Mother's Day, only I don't have to spend as much money. Fathers are often, I think, taken for granted. You know, as I have experienced this the last couple of months, I've seen just exactly the pull and the attention that moms have for their kids, particularly at a young age. And I think that kind of transpires as it goes forward and upward. As they get older, that attention and devotion still remains a little bit there. Dads have a different role, a different responsibility in the life of a child. And as such, I think they end up sometimes taking a back seat. However, if we look at cultures across the world, we have long determined and long seen a father figure that is central to the family structure. In many cultures, a father is the final authority, a man who, quite frankly, gives the okay or the blessing for anything that transpires, whether it is where you move or what jobs you do, who you marry, and so on. All those decisions all funnel through the approval of the father. In many cases, as we look at the culture, we find that there's some potential setbacks to that kind of a mentality. I'm not going to say that it's right or wrong, but there are certainly setbacks to it. And one of them is just the personality that I know myself tend to drive towards. And that's, I'm one of those people they define as a rule follower. The law says this, therefore I do it. And it irritates me to no end that other people don't. Right? So I lay the law down in my house and say, you're not going to do something. You know, little boys being little boys, of course, don't quite understand what I'm saying. So, I have to temper my expectations right now. But the fundamental reality is they don't do it. And I find myself getting a little frustrated by that. Even though I know full well, they're 3 months old. Come on, give them a break, right? But as they get older, I can expect this to continue. And when they're teenagers, Lord help me. But we have that tendency. There are certain people that have that idea that the rules need to be followed, whatever they may be. And I'm not saying that fathers set out to be overbearing or harsh or come off that way. In fact, I think if you were to ask them, they would all say they're operating in the best interest of their child. But sometimes we need a gentle reminder. This morning, we're going to look at a gentle reminder from the Apostle Paul. It's found in the book of Colossians. It's printed on the front of your worship folder, Colossians 3:21. It's just a simple verse. And unfortunately, it's the second half of a verse, or second half of an idea, I believe, found in Colossians chapter 3. The first part basically says, children, obey your parents, right? Honor your father and your mother, right? There's the command for the children. They're supposed to do that. Now we have the flip side to the same coin, right? It goes back, and here Paul writes, fathers, do not exasperate your children so they won't become discouraged. Here we have something that has an address, a command, if you will. It has someone who is supposed to go to. It has the actual command, and it gives us a reason for it. We want to look at those 3 points this morning. The first one is, who is this command addressed to? And it says right there, fathers. And as we were talking, this is a paternal, emotional individual. This is a relationship between somebody and a young child. In many cases, I know in our current culture and world, fathers really aren't in the picture. They're not. And so we can understand that this role of a father can be the role of a authoritative figure. All right? That could be possibly the mother, although in this case, I think it speaks more directly towards a man's mentality than it does a mom's. But in either case, it can exist of the idea of an emotional connection between someone with authority and a small child that they're raising. The head of the household, if you will, is another term that some people use to say that. And in many cultures, and particularly the culture of the time that Apostle Paul was writing this, respect for the father was a given. It was a given. In other words, there was no other option. You did think about this. You just did what he said. You gave your father respect. Obedience was expected. As a child, it was expected that you do not cross whatever your father says. And so on, it goes on. And take note that I want to add here that Paul does nothing in this passage to upset that standard of culture. Anyone who will tell you that the church came in to replace something, there's a lot to be said about that. And there's a big argument to be had. But Paul, in this particular passage, does not address that particular issue. Instead, what Paul says is we're going to acknowledge the standard cultural and social norms, and we're going to say that for the glory of God. In other words, the idea and the establishment of the family structure as Paul saw fit that was being exercised and practiced by Jewish and even pagan families during Paul's time was what Paul thought went along with God's plan. So, Paul does nothing, but rather it is expected that the culture norms, in this case the family structure, be reinforced. And it's very interesting because I know a lot of people come out today and they say, hey, that was written for that culture years and years and years ago. And I say, no, I don't think you can say that. Isaiah 40 says, the word of the Lord will stand forever. In other words, what God saw fit to put into print 2,000 some years ago is relevant for you and me today. So we find here that it's a paternal figure, a head of a household kind of figure that is addressed to. And the command that he says is very interesting. It says, do not provoke your children, or exasperate, as the translation says, provoke or exasperate, kind of a similar idea. I believe the NIV uses the word provoke and the Holman Christian Standard uses exasperate. The idea is the same thing. Basically, it's like that overbearing father, right? That guy that comes up there and shakes his finger at you every time, right? And he says, hey, this is what you got to do. Here's the law. You got to follow it. Paul's saying, hey, be careful. Be careful when you do that. Don't provoke your children. And what does that mean? Well, first of all, I think it's a misusing a God-given authority. God has placed the head of the household there for a reason. He's there for a purpose. And, children, as we found in the previous verse, are called to honor and respect that. And now fathers are being told, don't exasperate that because you have that God-given authority. Children are expected to honor and respect you. But if you go around and exasperate them, there's problems. And how do you do that? How do you provoke or exasperate your children? Well, I think there's two ways of doing that. One is clearly being too harsh. You've seen them. They're all over our culture today. A few years ago, we had a famous running back in the NFL that thought disciplining his son with a big old stick was appropriate behavior. Blew up in his face. He was suspended from the league for over a year. But he thought he was doing the right thing. He really did. That was, the way he was expressing what he thought was right. Well, here Paul's putting the caution flag saying, hey, don't provoke those children. Don't be too harsh. Don't be that guy that is very harsh. The other way that you can provoke your children or exasperate them is by being erratic. In other words, not even paying attention to how far you're going or what you're doing. In many cases, a lot of dads today will say, just wait till we get home and then you'll face the consequences, and they totally forget it by the time they get home, right? Now, you start doing that and you start saying that over and over and over again, eventually words mean nothing, right? When you're erratic in what you intend to do in the terms of the way you're doing it, it's going to be a problem. It will be a big problem. It's very fascinating also, I guess you could say, that as they have studied children, psychologists have found that the happiest child is a child that has clear and definitive boundaries. In other words, it knows what's right and what's wrong in the house. Those tend to be the happiest and most well-adjusted children around. You would think that that free spirit child that just runs around and does nothing and doesn't have to worry maybe about things, well, in the back of their head, they're always worrying about, who's going to take care of them, who's protecting them, where's that coming from? And the child where it's too harsh and can't do anything has no place in which they can explore their surroundings and express themselves peacefully. So a child with a well-marked boundary, as Paul says, don't provoke, but instead, the idea here is to provide that well-marked boundary. And I keep in mind that what he says, it doesn't say to don't exasperate the neighbor's kids. He says it doesn't say don't exasperate every kid. No, he says don't exasperate your kid. Your kid, your children, is basically speaking to the offspring of yourself or that emotional connection that you have, the relationship that you have with the child in your house, that head of household role. In many cases, we see stepfathers stepping up and taking the place of fathers today. We have situations where grandfathers come in and help raise their grandkids. Those kind of situations are what we're talking about here, okay? So this is not necessarily directly aimed at a paternal, biological father as much as it is someone who is in that position of authority. And it deals directly with those underneath you in terms of your relationship to them, okay? Your neighbor kid probably won't care too much about what you say. There may be a little bit of, uneasiness if you're scolding them for doing something wrong, but by the end of the day, that's largely past. But that relationship you have with your own kid or stepkids or grandkids will always be a thing that'll remember. So he says, do not provoke your children. And the very fascinating wording there is the do not. That is a command. Do not. It's not a suggestion. It's not something you can kind of maybe do when you feel like it. This is something Paul says, hey, this is required. It calls to mind the 10 Commandments, right? Where God himself says the words, do not murder. Paul here is using that in the kind of a expression that is very strong and very, if you will, authoritative. Do not provoke your children. You might be asking yourself, well, what's the consequences if I do? What's the bad things that'll happen if I do? Paul says, quite frankly, they'll become discouraged. Long-term effects of a father's behavior. Man, we can't even talk about that. I mean, the situation that you don't know or things that you can't explain because of an absence of a father are there. The stats are just mind-numbing. There's more crime in families that don't have a father figure. There's more premarital babies being born. There's more things happening, strife in the family, anger, problems, and issues when the father figure just isn't there. The situation is they become discouraged. Kids fall apart. They really do. They're fragile. We just may not realize just how fragile they actually are. We think about these things and we understand that that idea of being discouraged is very easy to give them. It doesn't even have to be harsh. It doesn't. You can be the most gentlest or kindest individual and still get your kids discouraged. A story I read this week said a man was illustrating this point, was that he struggled with math in the 3rd grade, right? And he just couldn't figure out multiplication tables, and he was having a hard time with it. And so the teacher sent a note home to the child's father and said, hey, this kid is having problems with math. The dad, being a nice guy, just looked at it and kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, well, son, I guess you're just going to have a problem with math. No sweat, no worry, you're just going to have a problem with it. And that's all he said. Years go by, the son started believing it, right? He stopped trying. He got to the point where test after test, it was expected he would fail. Somehow he made it into high school on math, and he actually came upon a point in time in a day when he looked at the blackboard and he realized, I know the answer to that problem. I know it. But he goes, but in the back of his mind, he's kind of going, but I'm never right, so maybe I shouldn't go up there. And so this man wrestled with that thought for a good few minutes. Nobody else in the classroom could understand it. No one else could solve it. And this guy's like, I'm pretty sure I know it. I'm pretty sure. But in the back of his mind, all he heard was his dad's voice. You have a problem with math. Don't worry about it. Finally, he raised his hand hesitantly, walked up to the board, and solved the problem. And the teacher looked dumbfounded, like, you haven't passed a single math test. I gave you the hardest one yet to date, and you solved it. It illustrated the point that the man was making. It doesn't have to be harsh. To discourage somebody, you can be really easy too, really soft, really kind. No, we're called not to exasperate the children, but we're also called not to totally ignore them, totally push things under the rug, totally let things just happen because they are. A broken spirit, discouragement, is something we have to be very careful and to guard the children. So we see who it's addressed to, this command. It's addressed to fathers, the head of the households. We see the idea that what they're saying is don't exasperate, don't provoke, don't get these kids so frustrated that they become discouraged. That's what Paul's saying. And so we sit there and we look on this on Father's Day, and it's a very typical Father's Day sermon, is it not? On Mother's Day, we honor moms. We say how glowing, good, nice things they are, and we say what they taught us. And on Father's Day, we tell the dads how to improve, right? Well, I'm going to flip this a little bit. I'm going to ask you personally, if you consider this text to be something that you can take to your own life, and the question that you're asking is, how does this apply to me? I want you to ask yourself this question. Who have you taken under your wing? Who have you shown something about this world? It can be somebody, anybody, a coworker, a friend who just came up, maybe somebody younger than you, maybe even someone older than you. But who have you taken under your wing to kind of show the ropes of a certain situation? Because I can guarantee you, it's the same principle. As you show these people a new job, show these people a new way of doing something, show these people perhaps, whether it's arts and crafts all the way to, the sky's the limit. Whatever you have done, and you've taken someone underneath your wing to show them, to train them, you can remember this point. Do not exasperate them, or else they will become discouraged. So this Father's Day, as we go out and we go back out into this world and we remember this message, not only is it talking about fathers here, it's talking about you and me. And it gives us guidelines, I guess, to achieve the greatest possible relationship we can with someone that's been placed under our wing, someone that has been placed under our care, or in some cases, our authority. Remember, do not provoke, lest they become discouraged. Let's close with a word of prayer. Almighty Sovereign Lord,